What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. I'm Colin Newby of 97.5 The Fanatic and 93.3 WMMR, coming to you weekly with Philly Sports Talk. And it's a big week in Philly sports because guess what? The Eagles are going to the Super Bowl.
I don't play the game for stats. I don't play the game for numbers, any statistical approval from anyone else. And I understand that everyone has a preconceived notion on how they want it to look or how they expect it to look. And I told you guys that winning and success is defined by that particular individual, and it's all relative to the person. And what I define it as is winning. And so the number one goal is always to come out here and win.
It's amazing how much doubt there is sometimes. I can't quite comprehend it because it doesn't look like people think it should look like, but the guy has been clutch. He's won a ton of football games, but you ran for this many yards. We don't care how we win. We don't care. If we rush for 300 and pass for 1 and we win, great. If we rush for 1 and pass for 300, great. Who cares? We've just continued to win. He's just continued to win. And
this is the third NFC Championship game the Eagles have won in 8 years. They're second in 3 years. But this one is a little bit different. It's a little bit out of the ordinary versus certain things that the Eagles have done in the past, ways that they've built this team, ways that they've gotten back on top. The Eagles, for most of the 21st century, have built their team in the trenches. That means the defensive line and the offensive line have to be towards the top of the NFL as individual units in order for the team to succeed. That was really the biggest root of their success back in 2017 and how they won Super Bowl 52. The defensive line was excellent all year. They ran so deep, basically 2 full units, and that was probably the best part of their team through the regular season. The offensive line was great too, and they really showed up in the playoffs, carrying the Eagles to the Super Bowl and allowing Nick Foles, enabling him, Nick Foles, who is not a mobile quarterback, to have the games that he had, to hit those receivers in stride because he had so much time to do so. Now, everybody considers that a major hallmark of the organization, really something that was started by Andy Reid all the way back in 1999 and carried through to the new regime, Howie Roseman coming up through Reid. But this team in 2024 is a little bit different. The additions that they made after the Super Bowl 2 years ago, after the season last year where they kind of had their weaknesses exposed, the changes they've made don't really align with the organization's philosophy. The big one being a high-profile running back coming to the team in Saquon Barkley, who's now an MVP candidate and is absolutely crushing it through the postseason. Also, how they've allocated resources on the defense. The edge rushers are not really a strength of the Eagles. Now, Nolan Smith has developed very well. I've talked about this during the playoffs especially. He's come into his own. But the edge rushers are not a strength of this team. They're actually as thin as they have been in the last, 5-6 years, probably before the first Super Bowl after the 2017 season. The edge rushers don't run deep. We'll see what happens with Brandon Graham. But for the most part, it's been Josh Sweat, Nolan Smith, and Jalix Hunt. And they haven't had these monster sack performances that you're maybe used to from some of the best Eagles teams in franchise history. Instead, they invested a lot of resources in the secondary, especially. And in last year's draft, they got Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean with their top 2 picks. They're 2 starters at cornerback, and both of them have been outstanding, especially Quinyon Mitchell was as sticky as glue in the regular season, and now he's starting to get those stats, 2 postseason interceptions. But the real change that came on defense, and today this is the biggest story that I want to talk about, it's Vic Fangio. In his first year as defensive coordinator with the Eagles, drawing on decades and decades of experience in the NFL, but he's found probably his best home, and this might very well be his best defense of his entire career as a DC, and throw in those few years with Denver as a head coach if you want to. Now, if you want to hear some controversial shock value and an opinion about Jalen Hurts or even about Nick Sirianni too, you can go ahead and turn to ESPN. If you want to hear people push back on that constantly, tune to 97.5 The Fanatic. But on this show, I'm going to be original and I'm going to look for the information that you're not going to get anywhere else. And today, I want to talk about Vic Fangio, and I want to talk about him in depth. But by Vic Fangio, I also kind of mean Jonathan Gannon, actually. My friend Bob Cooney used to say when he still worked for The Fanatic that he was intrigued by certain storylines. He didn't necessarily have his own opinion on them, but he was intrigued by them. Certain things in professional sports can be fascinating regardless of how you feel about them. And I have a topic here that fascinates me, intrigues me. That's the Vic Fangio defensive scheme and how it's evolved into one of the most important concepts in the modern NFL. Now, on the surface, a lot of people don't like the ideas of the Vic Fangio defense. The number one goal here being to eliminate explosive plays. That's pass plays of 20-plus yards, rush plays of 10-plus yards. And part of that philosophy has to do with how easy it's gotten to play offense in the modern NFL. The rules have changed. Everything favors the quarterback. It's incredibly difficult to play defensive back. Another reason I'm so impressed with the Eagles' corners. But just in general, football favors the offense at this point in time. So what Vic Fangio believes is that if you can eliminate those explosive plays and create your own splash plays on defense often enough, and by splash plays, I mean sack, turnovers, even pass breakups can be considered splash plays. But if you can create enough of those plays to disrupt what is going on offense and make an offense work hard, add more plays to their drive, increase the likelihood that they're going to make a mistake, then you're going to succeed on defense about as well as you can, given the concept of the modern rules and how the league is simply favoring offense on all turns. Now, Jonathan Gannon deployed a lot of these tactics while he was the Eagles' defensive coordinator the first two seasons under Sirianni in 21 and 22. Last year, Sean Desai took over for Jonathan Gannon, and he used a lot of the Vic Fangio principles. The organization follows this idea, the elimination of explosive plays as a key goal on defense. But those two guys, they didn't really deploy the Vic Fangio defense in the best terms that it's supposed to be deployed. And a lot of the weaknesses that you saw in the Jonathan Gannon defenses, they showed up big time in Super Bowl 57 on the biggest stage against Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, if you want to talk about raw point totals, then you can go ahead. I know the offense let up 7 points. Jalen Hurts fumbled, handed Nick Bolton the touchdown. The Eagles punt team also gave up a big play, let the Chiefs start a drive at, I believe it was the 5-yard line late in that game. That obviously is going to contribute to the offensive success that Patrick Mahomes had. But what I want to concentrate on is the fact that that defense had absolutely no answers for Patrick Mahomes in the second half, and I believe that's the biggest reason the Eagles lost that Super Bowl. I think they were good enough to win it, and the defense just could not come up with enough key plays, the splash plays that I'm mentioning, in order to keep Mahomes off the board and neutralize him enough to let Jalen Hurts and the Eagles offense take control of that game. Kansas City had 4 possessions in the second half. 3 of them were touchdowns, the first 3. The last one, it was a field goal, but guess what? It was actually better than a touchdown. The Eagles tried to let the Chiefs score to get the ball back, but Andy Reid ran the clock all the way down for a Butker field goal in the final seconds. And in that game, if you go back and watch, which I unfortunately did the other day, you'll see that Isaiah Pacheco had a lot of huge holes to run through that day. That's part of what Jonathan Gannon had been deploying as part of the Vic Fangio scheme to stop explosive runs. It's to give up the little runs. The Eagles were 17th in rushing defense that year. Part of the reason that happened is because they let teams chip away. If you remember that one loss they had that year to Washington on Monday Night Football, it's because they let Washington stay on the field, chip away, run a lot of plays, and they were successful short plays, and that was a vulnerability of Gannon's defense. Even if they didn't let up the explosive plays, they were still giving the cheap ones. And I think that soft passive scheme is a lot of what let Isaiah Pacheco get those huge holes in Super Bowl 57. You also had Kadarius Toney have the one TD untouched. And then the next possession, the Chiefs go to the opposite side of the field, run the same play, I guess the inverse of that play, and get another touchdown. And in those plays that I'm watching, I saw soft coverage all over the field. The Eagles secondary just did not do enough to challenge those Chiefs receivers. And a quarterback like Pat Mahomes, who is that talented, possibly the best quarterback in the history of football, he sat back there and he picked the Eagles secondary apart at will in the second half of that game. Now, I realize there were punts earlier. They weren't great, but ultimately, I believe that why the Eagles lost that game is because Jonathan Gannon's defense did not put up enough of a challenge to Pat Mahomes in the second half. Think all the way back to Super Bowl 52. The Eagles got torched in that game, too. They let up 500 yards passing, for God's sake. But they made a couple of plays that kept Tom Brady off of the board. You had the Brandon Graham strip sack, yeah, but you also had that big stop by Rodney McLeod on Rob Gronkowski. You had Brady dropping the ball. That's probably a little bit more just fortunate than actual talent. But the point being that the Patriots did not score on every possession, and in that Super Bowl, you just had the feeling that that's exactly what Pat Mahomes was going to do, and replace that Brandon Graham strip sack and the Super Bowl victory with the unfortunate James Bradbury holding 5 years later. And now I heard some pushback after that game, and to an extent I agreed with it, but the point a lot of people made is Pat Mahomes is just that good. A lot of defenses are going to look like they'll fall apart when Pat Mahomes is on the other side. Sure, that's true to an extent, but then I heard a great breakdown from Sheil Kapadia over at The Ringer, and he looked at the success rate of all offensive teams back in 2022. If you need an explanation of success rate, just head to my article at 975thefanatic.com about Vic Fangio versus the Chiefs. I'll get the link in the show notes. But Sheil took a look at success rate, and he found Pat Mahomes in the 98.9th percentile of success rates in all offensive games in 2022 with the statistics he put up in the Super Bowl. An EPA per drive, and this is usually by Pro Football Reference, he was in the 97th percentile of all offensive games for the season. If you look at Mahomes' career stats, all of the games of his career, 93rd percentile in success rate, 86th percentile in EPA. Point being, this is not what Patrick Mahomes does on a regular basis. He had a game that was towards the top of any game in his entire career, and he did it against a defense that finished third in the league in yards allowed that year. Why? Because the Jonathan Gannon defense was not suited to stop a great quarterback. This Vic Fangio defense in 2024, I think they are a lot better equipped. Sheil took the same stats and measured every Eagles game since 2000. And this is up to that point, by the way, after the Eagles lost Super Bowl 57. In the previous 400 Eagles games, going back to 2000, out of 400 games, that performance ranked 391st in EPA per drive from the Eagles defense and 395th in defensive success rate. Out of 400 games, I think it's safe to say that this was not just some typical Pat Mahomes great game. That defense had no answers for the Chiefs that day. After that game, I considered it a fatal flaw of that Jonathan Gannon defense, which was based off Fangio's scheme. Then, 2 years later, the Eagles get the actual guy that created it. They hire Vic Fangio in the offseason to become Sirianni's defensive coordinator, de facto defensive head coach, the way I see it. And again, it's this scheme that fascinates me. Trying to create splash plays, trying to eliminate explosive plays on offense. When the Eagles first hired Fangio, I remember worrying that it was just going to be the same song, different verse as Jonathan Gannon. This idea of limiting explosive plays, creating splash plays on defense might be too passive, and could it get the Eagles to another Super Bowl? Jonathan Gannon did, but it didn't stop Patrick Mahomes. So is that going to be the same thing with Vic Fangio? I believe the Eagles are better equipped this year. I'll tell you why on the other side of the break.
If it's happening in Philly sports, Colin Newby's talking about it. Go with him behind the scenes of legendary sports venues with the best athletes and the most iconic media personalities of the greatest sports city in the world.
Welcome back to First Time, Long Time Philadelphia. And I want to talk about the Eagles defense again. And I remember thinking back to when the Eagles made their hire, Fangio as the DC. I read Sean Syed's The Book of Fangio, and it's about a lot of the ideas, a lot of the concepts that I've been talking about. This idea of taking away offensive explosive plays and creating splash plays on defense as a philosophy of the modern NFL, and how Vic Fangio is really the one who introduced it. This conversation heading into Super Bowl 59 is really about Vic Fangio, Uncle Vic, if you will. This is the real test for him. He's got decades of experience. He's had a lot of success in the NFL, but he's got no Super Bowl rings. This is going to be the pinnacle of his challenge here. It's Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs, the quarterback who never loses, one of the best dynasties in the history of the NFL, who seems to keep winning in the most annoying ways possible. But with Vic Fangio, you have the number one defense in the NFL. Number one by DVOA. Number one by yards. The Eagles were dominant this season, possibly the best unit that Vic Fangio's ever put together. You have Jalen Carter benefiting from this defensive scheme. He's playing as well as he has in his 2 years in the NFL. You have excellent cornerbacks, rookie corners, who have really come into their own with Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. You have Darius Slay towards the end of his career, but playing almost as well as he has at any point with the Eagles. You've got the added benefit of an attitude on defense that Fangio's brought. He's allowing his best players to be at their best, playing extra snap. You've seen that with Carter especially. You've seen him try to increase the practice time this year so that the defense can get used to his terminology and get enough reps to master this complicated scheme. You've seen the defense put the pads on a little bit more, and that's a credit to Nick Sirianni for being willing to do that after the bye week when that's less and less common in the modern NFL. But we're really going to find out the worth of this Vic Fangio system when Pat Mahomes faces the Eagles again. You saw Jonathan Gannon in Super Bowl 57. He had no answers for Mahomes in the second half. They scored those 3 touchdowns They added that one field goal, which is actually worse than a touchdown because it allowed them to control the clock and neutralize the Eagles' offense. Now I'm going to consider this game a major measuring stick in the modern NFL. Is defense really helpless given the new rules? Well, Pat Mahomes seems to win in whatever way possible. It certainly seemed at times like there's nothing a defense can do to stop Patrick Mahomes when he's on his game. Now he's going to face the top defense in the NFL, led by one of the most impactful defensive coordinators in the modern era, and we're going to see if the Eagles defense can neutralize Patrick Mahomes enough and make enough plays to let their offense win the game for them, something that seemed impossible at points during Mahomes' career. That to me is the top storyline of Super Bowl 59, at least the one that I'll personally be looking the most into, and get plenty of great coverage on that one at 97.5thefanatic.com between now and the big game. We'll get plenty more Eagles talk over the next week and a half or so until the Eagles take on the Chiefs, but I wanted to finish today's episode with some Sixers talk because a big rumor dropped last week was from Bill Simmons of The Ringer about Bob Myers, the former Golden State Warriors executive, has been working as a consultant for the Washington Commanders. Consultant is one of my favorite words because nobody knows what it actually means. But anyway, it's been under Josh Harris, a sensitive subject in the city of Philadelphia. But with that Josh Harris connection comes a tie to the Philadelphia 76ers. Bill Simmons thinks that there's a possibility that Myers comes to the Sixers, presumably to replace Daryl Morey. Simmons also said that either Morey or Nick Nurse could be the fall guy with the mess that's gone on with the Sixers this year. Now, Bob Myers had 11 seasons with Golden State. He won 4 NBA titles, had 2 more trips to the NBA Finals, and he was a 2-time NBA Executive of the Year. That's as impressive as a resume as you're going to find, especially for an organization like the Sixers, who just has never gotten to that pinnacle for a variety of reasons, whatever excuse you want to make or explanation with injuries, factors inside or outside their control. They do not have the track record of Bob Myers with the Golden State Warriors, and they've never put together anything close, actually. I'm a little bit more willing than most people to give Daryl Morey the benefit of the doubt. I think most decisions that he's made in his time with the Sixers were the best possible decision at the time. I think that's true with some of the guys he's gotten rid of. I'm thinking of Al Horford when he first took over. He got rid of that Al Horford contract. I think that signing Paul George last summer, that was still the right move because it was the big idea of the entire organization to clear cap space. Well, you don't do that if you don't have the intention of signing the top free agent, and that's exactly what he did. He brought in Paul George. I think trading Ben Simmons for James Harden, that made the most sense at the time. I think he had to do that. So all these excuses I'm making for Daryl Morey, I'm not necessarily going to turn around and throw him under the bus and blame him for everything that's going wrong with the Sixers. However, I am going to say that they need to move on because these organizations, they cannot worry about what's fair and unfair. Josh Harris should not be thinking about, well, it's so unfair to blame Daryl Morey, because what's best for the Sixers would probably be to move on and to hire Bob Myers, if that is an actual option, as Bill Simmons seems to think it is. If you want to be a winning organization, if you want to build a dynasty like the Golden State Warriors did, then why not mimic what they did? Why not bring in the guy, the architect of the Splash Brothers, this team that dominated an entire era with Steph Curry and Klay Thompson and that group? And if Daryl Morey is your casualty, I don't know if he necessarily deserves it, but so be it. Daryl Morey is not the focus of this organization, and whether it's really his fault or not, he's let them fall into oblivion. So my vote is for the Sixers to go after Bob Myers. Head to 975thefanatic.com. Look at should the Sixers replace Daryl Morey with Bob Myers. I'll also include that link in the show notes. But I detailed this whole situation. There's some good quotes from Woj in there before he retired, tracing back to when Bob Myers stepped away from the Golden State Warriors. But while you're on the website, you're going to see a Super Bowl specific page, and I'm going to be a little bit more involved in Eagles content over the next couple of weeks, just with the magnitude of what's going on. I'm going to have some Super Bowl stuff coming out between now and February 9th. And just given the circumstances, hopefully we'll get some more breakdowns of Vic Fangio, Pat Mahomes, Jonathan Gannon, whoever. Thanks for listening, Philadelphia. This has been First Time, Long Time.